I'm going to do a quick overview of a timeline that I am going to share on the screen now. There, and share. Is it working? Is it?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay, I'm only going to look at the things in bold because I'll be going over things. So in 1801, Titus Coan was born. 1810, King Kamehameha united Hawaii. 1818, the death of Hawaiian named Henry Opukahia Ha'i'a died, and that inspired the first group of missionaries to go in 1820. Upstate revival started in New York under Nettleton and Finney, and Titus Coan was affected by those. You had a lot of percolating going on in upstate New York. The Church of Latter-day Saints was established in upstate New York in 1830. 1831 to 33, Coan attended Auburn Theological Seminary, which is upstate New York. 33, 34, he went on a missionary expedition to that southern South America area called Patagonia. He returned and married Fidelia Church. Soon after that, they left Boston Harbor for Hawaii. In Hawaii, a daughter of Hiram and Sybil Bingham was born in 1834, and I'll come back to her later. They landed on my birthday a few years beforehand, June 6, 1835, in Honolulu. There was an annual meeting of the American Board of Hawaiian Mission going on at the time. He was assigned to Hilo, where he served from 1835 until 1882. Not, within a year of his arrival, he learned Hawaiian well enough, and the Holy Spirit came down that he led the Hawaiian Great Awakening. In 1850, Mormon missionaries arrived in Hawaii. Sorry for the poor spacing, but 1861 to 65 was the American Civil War. He and his wife visited the United States, 1870 and 71. 1872, his wife Fidelia Bingham died. 1873, he married the much younger Lydia Bingham we saw earlier. And when they were in the United States, the first wife and Titus, that was when Ulysses S. Grant was president. Chester Arthur was president when Coan died. Prior to that, he finished writing his life in Hawaii. And now what I'm going to do is share as much as possible, and I will want to, you can write questions on chat, and after various sections I'm going to stop, but I'm going to share with you a sermon group of PowerPoints, and this isn't very professional. I'm leaving things up on the side, but there is an image of Titus Coan that is somewhat similar. I would say it is the image that was used for the sketch that is on the cover. I gave this message back in August to my church, and I came up with the phrase, God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Because if you look at his early life, you would not have guessed what happened in Hawaii. He was born in 1831, prior to President Jefferson's inauguration. They didn't do it until March in those days. He was born in Killingworth, Connecticut, and you might be able to see the star a little east of New Haven, where Yale is, but he did not go to Yale. He came into a deeper relationship with Christ, a deep discipleship when he was in Auburn, and he came under the influence of Finney, Charles Grandison Finney. Here's a picture of him in 1834. Finney had been an attorney. He had a born-again experience and became the Billy Graham of his age. This is Auburn Theological Seminary, an older building that Coan might have attended. And he knew his Bible from that time onward. And it was said of John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, that he bled Bible. And you could say the same about Titus Coan. I put in brackets the Bible verses he quoted or alluded to in my book, and I got a free index, the person and subject combined index I did pay for, but they accidentally did the Bible one, and that took 5 pages. And there were some that I thought, is that in the Bible? So I used my friend Mr. Google, and a lot of them were in the Minor Prophets that I didn't know about. And you could say with Titus Coan that, like has been in my life, God's will rarely goes in a straight line. This is Bryce Canyon. This is not the paved part, but it was scary enough for me when I drove it many years ago. And that's the least again of the curves. And I had to go under tunnels that had no side area to them. And the curveball that Titus got when he was at Auburn, getting very close to marrying Fidelia, was that the American Board of Commissioners asked him to go with William Arms to the area called Patagonia. So it's not just a clothing brand. Long before that, it was a southern area of South America. It is a very, that's a beautiful time of year, but you can see those ragged mountains and brutal winters, no Western civilization there, rumors of cannibals. Am I speaking too fast for the interpreter?
I don't think the interpreters have been able to start up, so go ahead.
Okay, are there any other questions before I get him to Hawaii?
What did he do in Patagonia? Was he was a missionary there too?
They rode around on horses and depended on the, well, back then they would have called them savages, the people that had very little contact with Western people. I mean, they came in contact with explorers who went around the Horn. And they tried to share the gospel a little bit, but there was just no infrastructure, if you will, for a Christian station to be established. And when he got back, because they didn't know if he'd even come back alive, it was hard getting transport and this and that. His wife said to him, my body just could not take the constitution to go there. And Hawaii had 15 years of mission infrastructure and a few doctors and that kind of thing. So they were scouting it out to see if it would be a mission station, but it didn't work out. So he had been ordained as a missionary in Park Street Church to go check out Patagonia. And then he was commissioned with others in his group to go to Hilo, Hawaii, not long after he married Fidelia. And I'll show you a picture of the two of them, I think, later on. So like I told you earlier, they arrived in Honolulu, that's misspelled, in June 6th of 1835. I don't know what year that is, but that gives you an idea of how Honolulu was very simple back then. It was mainly a whaling town, and you had the mission infrastructure. So you had churches. You might see the church in the background there, a steeple. And then the Hawaiian Great Awakening, I don't really have any images for. He arrived there, he started learning Hawaiian, and his first sermon he wrote out, and he preached it from a piece of paper. But then after 2 or 3 of those attempts, he preached from memory or with a little bit of notes. My cousin went to the Library of Congress where those Titus Coan papers reside, and under my direction, he took many, I only learned this recently, he bought a special camera, and so it wasn't his iPhone, and he took many incredibly sharp, perfect images for me. And so Titus Coan would write the Bible verse, an abbreviation, chapter verse, and the first few words of the verse, the subject. And he would go around, you really can't see it on the book, but I said Hilo was here. He had the entire district around here, and this part was called the Puna district. And he would go around and preach to 3 people, 12 people, 24 people. And there was a man who would follow him around like a pet. Someone just couldn't get enough of the gospel. And this man was a priest for the volcano goddess Pele. And he became a Christian. His sister was the priestess for Pele. She took some more convincing, but I tell you, once she became a Christian, she said, Pele is a false goddess. Do not listen to people about her. Listen to Titus, because he tells about the true God. I mean, I could tell you things about the founding 15 years before, but there's so much to share. He preached, he went around, and then at some point it sparked. There came to be an outpouring of the Holy Spirit in Puna, in Hilo, in the Hilo district. He had a church that he shared with another man named David Lyman, but people started coming in their whatever forms of boats from the other 3 islands to hear Titus Coan preach. And he became the pastor for 2 or 3 decades of the largest Protestant church in the world. On one day called the Day of Days, he baptized 1,702 people. They were organized militarily into groups, and they would come in the church and be told to stand up, and Titus would walk in between them with a big bucket of water and a brush, saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And he claimed he couldn't baptize by immersion because there weren't very many areas of deep water, but I beg to differ. You had Hilo Harbor right there, and he could have delegated on that day and had others help, but he was Presbyterian in background, so I'm not going to argue on that. So there was just a glorious time, and people were not lightly admitted as members. He took his time much more than I do. He had a little book, and he had people's names, and he kept track of their beliefs and behaviors. And you had to be in pretty good graces for a year if you wanted to be baptized and become a member. So there was something called the New Measures, and he was criticized for being stirring up people emotionally. But there was a time when he preached to many people in a natural amphitheater, and one man cried out loud about his sins. And he started going back and forth, and soon almost everyone was doing the same thing. And they were waving like a wheat field. And Titus Coan, a very loud wheat field, Titus Coan was silent for a half hour. And then they calmed down, and he shared with them how belief in Jesus Christ and following in his way and repenting of the sin, as important as that was more important than these outcries. So he was a powerful preacher, but he did not seek to stir people up. He was accused of being a Methodist, which back in those days involved some emotionalism. And again, you had spiritual things going on. You had, well, the Methodists had started in the 18th century, but they came into the 19th, and you had the Mormons in northern New York gradually moving east. The Great Awakening, sadly, even tragically, ended in 1840 when a scientific exploratory expedition ship called the XX for Exploratory Expedition arrived in Hilo Harbor. Titus Coan made some lifelong friends with the scientists on board, but they required some things of the Hawaiians that didn't work out well. They had them rolling logs up, I think it was Mauna Kea, to have an observatory, and it involved work on a Sunday, which Titus Coan gave a dispensation for. But the men were getting tired and angry, and it just broke the momentum of the awakening. But there were little mini awakenings throughout his life from then on. So I'll bring you back. So in my book, I call it Renaissance Man, and I have pre-Great Awakening and then 2 on the Great Awakening. Are there any questions at this point?
I don't have a question of you, but I want to ask Naomi whether she was able to get the translation working. Naomi, were you able to get the translation working?
Has she dropped out?
I don't know. She's not answering, so I'll let it go.
Yes, she's doing. She's doing the translation.
Okay. Does somebody have a question? Okay. So he was a revivalist, and he was also a Renaissance man. I have one chapter on his being a scientist. He kept track of rainfall. You may know that Hilo is one of the rainiest cities in the country. He kept track of temperatures. It stays pretty much between low 70s and upper 80s. There were also several tsunamis that hit Hilo. If you look at how Hilo is, it is in such a place that it can be hit from the north by tsunamis and from the east. And again, through Google, I was able to find out where there had been earthquakes south of Alaska and east of South America, and the tsunami came and hit. And he ministered to the people after they hit and reminded them that we don't know what tomorrow or even today holds. It is such a tsunami location that there is now a tsunami museum in Hilo. So, and Titus Coan climbed volcanoes, active volcanoes, at his own risk. In 1850, a little shed was built that came to be called Volcano House, and there have been various ones since then. There's now a 40-bedroom Volcano House location. And if my wife and I ever get there, it was canceled twice by COVID, and we're this year also medical issues. But I will get the room that overlooks the crater. But I will be in great comfort compared to Titus Coan, and there were scary things that happened. This is just an image of lava that I have. And here's what you're more accustomed to seeing. This is the crater, I believe, that the Volcano House overlooks. Sometimes it has water in it, but most of the time it has what's called a lake of fire or a lake of lava. When I first saw Titus Coan referring to the lake, I was confused, but then I figured it out. Okay, now I'd like to talk to him about being a peace man. I think Brethren people would like that. I think he would have great affinity with the peace emphasis of the Church of the Brethren. He corresponded with 2 Quakers, who Quakers you may know are pacifists. They disagreed with him about the Civil War. Titus Coan called it the War of Rebellion and said it would not have happened if the pastors had done their jobs. I think especially the Southern pastors. He had been involved as a 12-year-old in a pretend military group. He was inspired by the War of 1812, but he forswore that. And the verse that he quoted the most was Isaiah 9:6, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And Prince of Peace is, he just, in letter after letter to a journal called the Advocate of Peace, and in his letters and all of his writings, he referred to the Prince of Peace. And he also said, if I ever became a disciple of Christ, then I became a peace man. The two were interwoven, being a Christian and being an advocate for peace. He did have military things in Hilo, but they were peace military. He organized the children to be an army for peace, and they gave money. They gave their little amounts that they could give to the Advocate of Peace and other peace organizations in the United States. One time he apologized that he could not and they could not send as much because they were building a new church and it was costing a great deal. He also reached out to the neighbors, the sailors in Hilo Harbor. There started an English chapel, which was in the afternoon. His focus was always on the Hawaiians, but he wanted to bring everybody to Christ. So in the afternoon, there was an English chapel where he spoke in English. And he also, well, back around the same time the American Board started in the early 1800s, the American Bible Society started. So they would send him Bibles and tracts and Bibles in other languages. There were Portuguese sailors that came in. So he'd be along the harbor handing out these tracts and talking as he was able with the sailors. And he was very concerned about the sailors and that they would have some kind of a Sabbath on Sunday. And so he wrote a book called The Sailor's Sabbath, which again I talk about in the book. So there's maybe an early 1900s image or late 1800s, because the middle ship has some smoke coming out of it, so it would be a steamer. And so in our day, I hand out booklets like What on Earth Am I Here For? And he handed out booklets for the sailors to consider Christ. He interacted with Catholics and Mormons. I'm going to focus on the Mormon side. I'll tell you why in a bit. There's an image of an older Catholic church in Hilo. It has a crucifix, Jesus on the cross. In our churches, Jesus is not on the cross because he is risen and coming again. But I don't know if you recognize who this man is. Last name of Smith. Joseph Smith, right. So he started getting his vision, so-called, and I'm not going to go into what I think of Mormonism. I had the privilege, I have very fine Mormon friends, especially in Escondido. I had one-on-one Mormon evangelical dialogues with them, and that led to my being able to have an interaction at my church with about 160 people present. We would have had more, and the Mormons would have filled the patio with 150 more, but they knew that, but they wanted non-Mormons to understand what Mormons believe. So I had a dialogue with the dialogue professor from Brigham Young University. But anyway, Smith started in around 1830 when Coan was in upstate New York and Smith was in upstate New York. And then he died, and you had Brigham Young leading the Mormons to Salt Lake City, I think in the late 1840s. And Brigham Young wanted Mormons to send gold back from California, but not very many were. So he sent 8 young men and instructed them to mine and send back gold. And so the leader of that group was named George Q. Cannon. And Brigham Young said, well, you know, it's cold in the winter there in California. You can't mine, so why don't you go to the Sandwich Islands and take the true religion? I will tell you that Cannon did send back some gold, and this is a gold $20 coin. Let's see here. Going back to Cannon. So the 8 of them arrived and they cast lots. That's how the Mormons did it, like dice. Who was going to go to which island and who was going to go with whom? Cannon went to Maui, and 2 others came to the big island of Hawaii, and others followed, including nephews of Smith and Young. I mean, they had a lot of nephews and nieces, but anyway, Cannon had kept a journal in Maui, and he wrote about arguing or dialoguing with an American board missionary on Maui, and I'm sure it was the same with Coan. But when the Mormons first met Coan, they tried to flatter him. But when flattery would not work, they tried to spread lies about him. But Coan knew his Book of Mormon better than they did. He brought out his Book of Mormon, and it was dog-eared and it was underlined, and he just sliced and diced them, and I think they retreated. But Cannon on Maui talked to a Hawaiian who had gone to a American board school and had become a lawyer and a judge. And he became a Mormon. And this is the Book of Mormon, I believe, in English. But eventually Cannon and Napela, which was his name, went back to California and finished the translation of the Kabuke a Moramona. Kabuke a Moramona, meaning the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon is in Hawaii prior to 1860. They retreated almost completely off the islands, came back 20 years later or so and became much more present. They have the Polynesian place and a little Disneyland kind of place on the other side of Oahu. Any questions so far? I could go on, and I'm aware of the time. In 1870 and 71, Titus and his wife Fidelia went to the United States. They were, instead of going around the Horn of South Africa, they took a steamer from Hilo or Honolulu right to San Francisco. And one of their sons, who went by Latimer, met them. He lived there. He had written them about how to prepare and what to bring and all of that. And so they got on a train. And I don't know if you ever thought about this. I hadn't until the research I did. But the Transcontinental Railroad was to Abraham Lincoln what going to the moon was for John Kennedy. It was Lincoln who called for the Transcontinental Railroad. And there's the golden spike showing the completion where the two buildings coming together. Al, you told me, when did the trains come through California?
Well, of course, as you know, this is 1869 right here, and this is the Central Pacific on the left, and then the Central Pacific folks created the Southern Pacific, which then went through California, got to Los Angeles in 1875. So certainly this.
Okay, thank you. Well, they were after the gold rush, though, which is interesting. But we have a train track north-south on the east side of McFarland. So that's interesting to connect that. So they went to many places. Titus could not possibly go to all of the places where he was invited. He did go to Oberlin College in Ohio, and those are buildings from the 19th century. There is a 20th century statue of a train track coming out of the ground, and that symbolizes the Underground Railroad. Charles Finney was very much in favor of the Underground Railroad, but his family took out the places in his memoirs that talked about it because it was too controversial. A professor of mine, along with another man, put those back in the 1980s. And those passages are much more interesting to read. So I'm glad that the text has been restored. But he came to Oberlin because there was a statewide meeting in Iowa of the Congregational Ministers, annual meeting. And Coan preached there. This is the church that Coan built. And I don't know if you can see down below, there's almost no blocking of the view of the pulpit, because here's the older Charles Finney, apparently had these like really light blue eyes that just penetrated. And he didn't want anybody to be able to duck behind a pillar while he was telling them what sinners they were, okay? So Finney was at that meeting, and it kind of came full circle. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker, or Anakin Skywalker, but I guess Luke did better. Finney and Coan and a pastor from Texas who worked with freed slaves led the communion service. So Coan had a deepening relationship with Christ in the 1830s, and now almost 40 years later, he serves communion with the man primarily responsible for that. So that was a full circle. He made his way, they made their way ultimately to Washington, D.C. And I haven't told you very much about my research process. I like to dig. And while I was researching this, I developed 3 holy grails. Each one took some digging to dig out. Well, 2 out of the 3. One of them was the 1-paragraph reference he made in his second wife's memorial volume with a lot of letters and journals that beautifully complemented his memoirs. He has 1 paragraph about a week in Washington, D.C., and in that, he has 1 sentence where he says, "We visited the White House twice." Come on, I need more than a sentence. I ultimately found he wrote such a long letter to a newspaper in Honolulu that it took 2 editions in the paper to get it all in. And it turns out a retired doctor from the mission organization was living in DC. He was acquainted, I guess, with General Grant. And Titus Coan, you have to understand, was a rock star. And so Dr. Peter Parker set up an appointment for him to see him. Now, I don't know if it was Parker, if that's from Spider-Man, but anyway, Coan said he lived up to his reputation of being a man of few words. And he also said, "We left him as we found him, with a pen in one hand and a cigar in the other." And we all know sadly that that habit led to his cancer of the jaw. But the second visit to the White House turned out to be the next night, because during the first visit, Mrs. Grant waltzed in and said, "Oh, you two must come to my soiree tomorrow night." So she invited them to a party at the White House. And what was most interesting to me about Coan writing about that party was that he was writing about the vice president's wife. He had married her when he was the Speaker of the House, and I believe she was much younger than he was. And there was a lot of gossip about her. And Coan wrote how terrible this gossip was, and then he told what the gossip was. He needs to read Ephesians 4, but I guess he's human, okay? So Titus Coan gossiped about the vice president's wife. So they made their way back across the United States, and now we're entering the last years. Here's a picture from 1850. I believe Fidelia was in her 40s. And when I look at that picture, I see a tired woman. I see a woman whose constitution wasn't all that great. It was the environment of, and some people couldn't handle the Hawaiian environment, all the humidity and the rain and stuff. She did great work. She worked with children and all of that, but I believe she developed cancer. The descriptions that I read, I checked with 3 doctors. One said probably. The other one said, I don't want to diagnose without seeing the patient. And the third one said, you know, I just don't even want to comment about it. But anyway, I believe, non-medical student, that she died of cancer, but she was able to do so back in her beloved Emerald Bower. That's what they called their home. They took over a missionary's home within months of the departure of another missionary. Small place that Coan built and built and built. And here's one of the fun details of research. He writes about ordering the copper nails, copper or brass nails that he used on the house. So Lydia died with Titus and others at her side. She was buried. He grieved greatly. He wrote an ode to his wife that just, it's very Victorian in its flowery language and how he misses her. And it's in the book if you want to buy it. I put my email address there, another shameless plug. You can write me and we'll talk about how I can get 1 or more copies to you. But the interesting thing is 1 year later, you remember that daughter of Hiram Bingham, who was about 6 months old when the Coans arrived in Honolulu? Fidelia Bingham. This is 1866, so she was 31 then. She led a girls' school in I believe Cincinnati before she moved back to the islands. In 1872, she married a man who was 34 years older than she was. Charles Finney had 3 wives, 1 in a row. I think they might have died in childbirth or something, and I think each one was younger than he was. And a lot of missionaries lost women in childbirth or to diseases, and I've looked through, and many of them married younger women, but I think Titus Coan holds the record. Fidelia was 1 year older than Titus's oldest child, and 3 years old, a son, 3 years older than his oldest daughter. I mean, there was never ever any scandal with them, except the age difference. And his daughter, Hattie, I think was upset that she was not going to be the one to take care of her father in her old age. So there was some disagreement in the Hawaiian missionary community. And in a letter a friend of mine found, she talked about how there was no mention of the wedding in the missionary letter, missionary publication, the monthly issue of the Friend, she said how much it hurt her. But theirs was a true love. He loved her with all his heart. He wrote her a letter when she just took a steamboat from Hilo to Honolulu and then would be back. But he said, my heart went with you as I watched the steamer leave. And she encouraged him to write the book on Patagonia. And she helped him greatly in the writing of the memoirs. And jumping ahead a little bit, after Coan died, she did put together that amazing memorial volume, which was a great benefit to me. And then, yes, here is Adventures in Patagonia. Here is the cover of one version from the 1990s of his memoirs. He rode a horse within months of his death. He said he was he was more sore in the saddle than he had been, but he still was going around preaching the gospel in the churches. He had mentored Hawaiian men to be pastors, to be missionaries to the Marquesas Islands, to the Micronesian Islands. He went and visited them twice. I have 2 chapters on that, other things as well. But here's kind of a sad 19th century Victorian thing about missionaries. Fidelia wrote a letter to her sister-in-law saying how hard it was to take care of him after his stroke, because if you've ever dealt with someone who's had a major stroke, you know they're basically dead weight. And, you know, for her to lift him into bed and take care of him. So she poured her heart out to her sister-in-law, but then she said, you must tell no one about this. My heart broke when I read that. You know, in our day and age, people would say, oh, let me help. You know, I have a strong husband, you know, let me have him help you. But no, she wanted to keep it covered up. And ultimately he died when Chester A. Arthur was president. So we've gone from Jefferson in the early 1800s, 1801, to the early 1880s. He was, I believe, 81 when he died. His son, firstborn son, did finish up the memoirs with the proofs and everything else. In the index, he mentions his mother twice, his stepmother not at all, even though she is referred to. It just says, when Mrs. Bingham arrived in Hilo. Well, that was when she got married. I don't know if the son kind of edited that. I don't know if I'll ever know. I might someday hold in my hands a copy, a handwritten copy that's at the Smithsonian. Here's a view of Hilo Harbor from the water. You see that hotel there. Again, if Karen and I do go there, I'm planning on getting, I mean, it's just a once in a lifetime, and I've set aside a budget from some income I received a couple years ago, getting as high up corner hotel room, and actually their prices aren't that high, in the 200s. I mean, Waikiki, something like that, we're talking 500 to 700. So he had put on his tombstone the last part, part of John 11. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And basically he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he has this, and then it says what Jesus says to a sister of Lazarus from the King James, believest thou this? So he's preaching the gospel on his tombstone, and it is still legible. You can still read it. I mean, the wind and the rain has worn it some. I don't know if there's been touch-ups or not. I could ask a friend of mine, but he's still preaching the gospel on his tombstone. Okay, his legacy. I told you about 3 holy grails. I'll tell you about one I have not found and probably will not find. I came across 2 references to his giving monthly lectures on the Bible. And there's a reference to him saying, I have completed my series. So over 2 or 3 decades, he went from Genesis through Revelation. And oh, how I would like to have those lectures. I would put together one book with just the lectures and some footnotes, and a little bit of window dressing, and then another book about it. But I don't think that's going to happen. It's not at the Library of Congress. The church, this is the memorial volume Lydia Coan put together. This is his church called Hialeah Church. You can read about it some on Wikipedia. But they had a fire in the 1830s, and if it was there, it's gone. The archives in Honolulu, it's not there. And now I'm wrapping up the sermon. How is God using you? What will your legacy be? We have a sign in our church where, like football players, where there's some saying where they slap the top of the door before they go onto the field. We slap, our pianist does it a lot. You are now entering the mission field. In other words, going into McFarland. And I was told by 2 separate people, unknown to each other, that God was going to use this book to bring revival in Hawaii and around the world. And my prayer is that will happen. There were other things that came out last year. A church in Honolulu, the first one, did an amazing one called A Witness to Aloha. And they brilliantly weaved Hawaiian Christians and the missionaries together and brought it down to the present. So with that, I mean, I could tell you stories about any of what I've talked about, but I'll open it up for Christian questions first. How many people do we have, by the way?
We had at one point 10. We currently have 9.
Okay, did Sarah Stevens join us?
If she did, she came in by another name.
Oh, okay. You there, Sarah? Here, Sarah? I guess not. Okay. Anyway, does anybody have any questions?
One of the things I think you didn't tell everybody else, I certainly know, is that you only, this book only came out like 3 weeks ago, and that's
Yes.
why it's so exciting on your brainstem.
This is true. October 21st, when I was sicker than a dog, it was the week after my surgery, and that was the worst day after my surgery. So my wife comes home, she brings it inside, opens it up. She's so excited. But I've been able to be excited about it. October 21st. Oh, and then the second Holy Grail that I got was his will. Each county in Hawaii, each major island is a county. So I called Hilo, and they said, that's so old, it'll be in the state archives in Honolulu. So I called, and the man was really nice because he had been getting calls before, I'm sure. And it was a law library, but he cheerfully gave me the number that was correct. And she found him on the microfilm, and she sent me his entire will, a copy of it, copied off of a microfilm, for less than $10. His second wife was an executor, and his second son was an executor. Not the first son, not the second daughter. Well, okay, I can see that. He said, you may divide my books up among yourselves. He encourages them to get along. He had been given land by Hawaiian royalty, and to this day it has a great deal of water, and it's worth a great deal. I think it provides half the water for Hilo. It answered some questions and raised some other questions. But it was interesting to see it written in his hand following, I, Titus Coan, being of sound mind and body. And to show you how small the legal community was at that time, his lawyer was a son of that other missionary, the co-pastor at that church. He was a lawyer and he was also the judge. So he witnessed it along with one or two other people. And he was the probate judge. So you do what you have to do. A little more about the research process. I scratched the surface in, I came across him in 1989 when I was starting to research my dissertation, which was published in 2009. It's called The Field as the World. I looked at the first 30 years of the American board, so that fit in at the end with the Hawaiian Great Awakening. I wondered, who is this guy? So after this was published, which is a story in itself, I started to scratch the surface October of 2009, and I found a digitized online version of the memoirs, and I checked the email, and it was an active one for a descendant of Titus Coan named Ed. And he and I have become email friends. He helped me with research. He edited it with me. He did one of the blurbs on the back. I didn't want to read much, but what he wrote really touched my heart. This book opened my eyes to Titus's remarkable life as a co-founder of Hawaiian evangelism in the native environment of the mid-19th century. Corr, that would be me, brilliantly interweaves disparate source materials to illuminate Titus's enthusiasm and intense devotion to the Hawaiian community through his commitment to the evangelical mission and its profound effect on those he served. One can't help but find it uplifting and illuminating. And I could not have done this book without Google, without online stuff. One time Ed sent me have you ever done a Google book search? He set it up for me for Titus Coan. I was going from one book to another. I was taking notes for 3 weeks on one book led to another on all these 19th century books. And Ed put me in touch with a man named Paul Raposa, he started out just wanting to put the Coan memoirs online. Then he put the memorial volume online, and now he has everything written by or about a 19th century missionary to Hawaii online for a very reasonable price. And I talk about that in the acknowledgments and I think the bibliography. But one thing led to another. For instance, in 2010, I went to a denominational meeting of the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference, and a friend of mine who was in the United Church of Christ, had been at the Hawaii conference, said, you should go to a meeting at the Congregational Library in a few months because they're having a 200th anniversary get together. Well, I couldn't afford to go, but I redid my introduction and my bibliographic essay on primary sources using internet stuff now from my dissertation. But ultimately, they asked me to write the chapter on Titus Coan. And I don't know if any of you have published books. I use that as the anchor for what's called a new title proposal. And the same publisher that Daniel last night mentioned, or 2 nights ago mentioned, he was thinking about using, put together that chapter biography that I had, and they accepted it. And here, 9 years later, they did publish it. My main research took place between 2009 and 14. I talked about Titus Coan so much in my family that we consider him another member of the family. From October of 2015 through 2016, I wrote like a man possessed and put together an over 700-page double-spaced manuscript which in the way with the way Whip and Stock does it, they use a smaller print. It's readable though. And so it came out to a mere 538 pages. I had chipped, but don't be intimidated. My sister's already finished chapter 3 and others, but you can dip into the different areas. If you like volcanology, you can go there. If you like revival, you can go there. And I'll stop again, but I can talk some more. So I've given you a little window into the research and publication process.
One of the things you didn't talk about is how Titus was inspired to go into missionary work in the first place.
Okay, it's a little murky. You don't have much, you don't have any Martin Luther agony with John Calvin. With John Calvin, it's just a light switch went on, okay? So Coan goes to upstate New York. He's a teacher. He has a deepening relationship with Christ through Finney. And very early in that process, he decides he wants to be a missionary. That's basically all I know. Let me see if I can find any more. Let's see, because he had already, the American Board of Commissioners was the only game in town in the country if you wanted to be an overseas missionary. Okay, well, there's Patagonia. Before then, okay.
Well, that's okay. You don't have to pull it out of your book. I thought maybe you had.
They're really, okay. In early 1833, Fidelia writes Titus about her growing sense of call to the mission endeavor. And Titus writes Fidelia he had about his, at the end of 1832, about his passion for the lost. He wrote her, and I quote Elke, I will tell you that I found a unpublished master's thesis that could be a dissertation written by a woman in the 1980s about Coan and Fidelia. But he writes, but oh, the heathen, no Sabbath, no Bible, no Savior, no one to point them to the morning star, faintly twinkling through the midnight of sin, which hangs heavily on their eyelids. So, and in January of 1832, this is backing up, writing about the seminary, I think a missionary spirit is rising among us. So maybe it hit by 1831. His passion for souls extended to the whole world, because he ministered in a prison while he was there. He wasn't just looking out, he was doing the work of an evangelist. So thank you for pressing me on that. So there I was pounding my book. It was early 1831-32. The revival, the effect on his life, and how missions intertwined with that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if you look about it's the pre-Patagonia chapter before that. Anyone else have questions? I mean, there's so much. I know it's like drinking out of a water fountain.
Well, I had a question for you, Phil.
Please.
You said that the Great Awakening ended in 1840. I missed when it started. When did the Great Awakening start? 1836.
Okay,
thank you.
It was basically the summer of 1836, and that was just it was a year after he had arrived in Hilo.
Wow. And what is his at one point you showed a book that showed 1835 to 1882, and I realized that's the years he was an evangelist. Do you have like when he was born to when he passed away?
Yes.
Oh.
Let me go to my, I'm going to share another document. He was born February 1st, 1801 in Killingworth, Connecticut. And he died in Hilo, December 1st, 1882. So he was 81.
81 years old.
And just a couple months from 82.
Wow. Thank you. I was just curious about those
Sure.
things. So.
I raced through everything because I didn't know how it was going to go.
Oh, you did great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to go back to the images. I want to thank Al for helping me practice on this. I could not have done it without him. No, that's not it. Where are you? Come on. There we are. Okay. Okay, is that filling the screen?
No, you have to share if you're going to show something.
That's right. Thank you for the reminder. Back to that one. Yeah, this is the one with the different slides. There was a letter from Fidelia to Titus saying, why didn't you tell me that you were bringing Lydia from your visit to the volcano shed or house, whatever? I would have brought a basket of peaches. You know, it's those little things that are so much fun in research. And, you know, kind of shows the household. And something else that I'll share, since I've got a few more minutes, that I have a subsection in their arrival in Hilo, is how desperately they longed for mail, for correspondence. You and I are instantaneous. My wife and I can FaceTime her niece and husband in Thailand as missionaries. We FaceTimed our daughter in South Africa when she was studying there and ministering as a nurse. All they got was what came from the latest ship. I don't see myself, but that's just as well anyway. And ships would sink and letters would be lost. So, you know, they wrote each other island to island, but they were pining for family letters from the mainland. And when missionaries left in those days, you know, unless they had to come home for health reasons or something else, they were not thinking they would ever come back. But like I said, I don't know when the steamer started. They took the steamer from Hawaii to San Francisco and then the Transcontinental Railroad. Do you have other questions or anyone else? If you buy the book, you get all the details. I did write my email in chat, so you can write me about setting up, you know, you might want to get one for the church library because it's a good history of missions book as well. Like the pastor, well, he's now just retired of Coan's church, is a Dallas seminary graduate, good guy. He paid for 3. I gave him 1 free because he'd been so much help to me. 1 was for an elder in his church and 1 was for the Lyman Museum. There's a little bit of envy with people at the Lyman House because Titus Coan, like I said, is the rock star. Al, it's 7:40. I don't know if we're wanting to wrap this up, if there aren't other questions. Because I could tell you yarns for hours upon hours.
How did he get interested in the science? You said he kept the temperatures, he kept the water, he noted the tsunamis. Even today, you said that the people in volcanism see him as important because of all the information you took on that. Was that just a hobby? Were all those just hobbies?
It was a hobby. He was just an inquiring, curious guy. He was dubbed the pen painter. And what I read in there about his call to save the heathen, you know, he didn't use one word when 5 would suffice, but Don Davis and Linda Davis are going to Maui tomorrow. And he said, you know, because we're scuba diving, we can't go to Haleakala. They've been up there before. I read to him a 5-line sentence that was like a video of looking down the slope of the volcano. But no, they, at their website, we proudly link to Titus Coan's memoirs. How many scientific organizations are proud of a missionary? That shows you how significant it was. He also, I include in the science chapter earthquakes, but I use that as a transition to the beginning of the first of 2 volcano chapters. Because especially in 1868, interestingly enough, it was a 6.8 magnitude earthquake that occurred just as one of the active volcanoes just shot up. And so being from Southern California, it's kind of fun to read the, did you feel it? But sadly, you know, some people's homes are destroyed in major earthquakes on the Big Island. He corresponds with a missionary named Paris who had that happen, but I don't think anyone died. And he got caught up in some kind of volcanic situation, and he was hugging his Hawaiian colleague, and they were shouting out to God how he had saved him. And so it gets kind of wild. This image you see, this is what I sent to the publisher. I said, you know, something like this image and something like the background with Hawaii in the background. But again, she thought to include all 4 islands, which go right down to Apostle to the Sandwich Islands, because not everybody knows that that's what it was called. I mean, that phrase is taken from his preliminary obituary by the New York Times. So think about it. Let's see, just a second.
Yeah, David, did you have a question? Was your hand up?
Yes, I don't know if the it's it's a different topic. I'm not topic. I mean, different issue. Trying to face it there. Is this evangelist has a record of how many people believe in Jesus, or how many people like?
Well, he did in his. Yeah, the numbers were thousands and thousands. It might have been tens of thousands. All I know is that he baptized 1,702 people in one day, and that he had the largest Protestant church in the world. Oh, take it back. In the revival chapter, at least, I don't know about his records after the revival. I hope I got in a chart. I took an image and tried to get it in. Let's see. I have the places where he went in Puna. Go to the next chapter and see if it's in there. Because that's a really good question, because he did have actual charts with boxes, what we would call a spreadsheet. You know, how many were, so I don't have the actual charts, but he did do that. And I don't have his memoirs with me, so I can't do that. So yes, he was very precise. And so that was kind of in all of his life with science as well. So yes, he did keep track. He prepared what was called a station report every year. And I think, and those are online through an organization in Hawaii. If you went to each of his station reports, you could count it up, but you have people die, you have some people fall away, you have new people come in. But he did, every year he prepared, I think, along with, the Mormons showed up and then they left, or the Catholics came and then they kind of, not too many of them. He did provide numbers. And I see it's 746.
Oh. There's another question. Maybe I want just see if you have any knowledge about. We hear about the Azusa revival in the United States in California, and
Yes.
there's any similarity of this revival talking about?
Oh, there could well be. I think that was like 100 years later or something, but the enthusiasm, or 70 years, the enthusiasm of it, the Pentecostal kind of sense of it, I would say it's similar. I mean, awakenings have similar things. I mean, when people wake up and they realize they've been asleep or dead, they get excited, and they should. I mean, Jonathan Edwards in the first Great Awakening, it was great that God used the greatest mind of that generation to interpret it to other people and go through his church as well, because he read his sermons and the Holy Spirit came down, but he also talked about false, spiritual signs of revivals. He didn't accept everything. And that's important to keep in mind for any outpouring of the Holy Spirit. There can be, the devil tries to get into it as well.
Yes.
Don't want to end with the devil, but I think we need to.
Yeah, we have run out of time. David, did you get all the questions answered that you wanted to ask?
You have my email, dphilcorr@yahoo.com, on the chat. Write me all the questions you want, okay?
All right, thank you. That
You're
was good
welcome.
enough.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming too, and thank you, Phil, for this wonderful presentation and your great book. And I know you're still recovering from your surgery, so
But this revived me.
Yeah. So I'm sure you're exhausted.
I'm not tired. The interesting thing is I've been noticed, thank you, David. My left eye's kind of been going up and down, and I think it's from going back and forth from one screen to another so much, so that'll go away. But just to let you, I'm doing much better. I'm near the end of my 4th week, or in my 4th week, which means this weekend Karen will be grilling me salmon, and we are buying cod fillets from Schwan. And in a few weeks, I will be able to have just about everything in small portions and trying to eat healthier. I've been looking around, like when I go to an Italian restaurant, eventually I'll get a chicken Parmesan, but it has to be without the noodles until April. And I can have the mozzarella cheese and I can have the marinara. So looking forward to that, but I'm not the food channel. So I'll let you take care of us, Joe Vecchio, and we'll be out of here.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. There'll be another night tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, there we are. Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Dave. Great questions.
Okay.
And please email.
Thank you.
Good night. Sleep tight and pleasant dreams to you. Do you remember where that's from, Al? That's from Lawrence Welk.
Lawrence Welk. Well, yep. Okay, good night, everyone. I'm going to close us out. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.